You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The Monroe Doctrine is all about the United States standing against European countries trying to control or start new colonies in the Americas. Essentially, if European powers tried to meddle with any countries in the Americas, the U.S. would see it as a threat. President James Monroe first presented this idea on December 2, 1823, in a speech to Congress. At that time, many Spanish colonies were fighting for or had just won their independence. Monroe made it crystal clear. The Americas were off-limits for European expansion efforts, but the U.S. wouldn't interfere with existing European colonies or their affairs in Europe. When Monroe made this announcement, the U.S. was not in a position to enforce his doctrine due to its lack of a strong military or navy. However, the United Kingdom found the doctrine to be in alignment with its own objectives and helped support it. Despite some challenges along the way, by the 20th century, the U.S. had grown strong enough to enforce the doctrine on its own. It became a foundational element of American foreign policy, influencing the United States' interactions with other nations for more than a century. Various presidents, including Ulysses S. Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan, have invoked the Monroe Doctrine in their policies. Beginning in 1898, perceptions of the Monroe Doctrine started to shift, emphasizing collaboration and non-interference in the internal matters of other countries. This change was officially adopted in 1933 under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, notably with the establishment of the Organization of American States. The Monroe Doctrine's relevance and interpretation have continued to evolve into the 21st century, with perceptions varying depending on the context and current international relations. From its early days, the United States preferred to keep to itself, steering clear of European affairs. However, the seeds of the Monroe Doctrine, a crucial policy stating that the United States would remain apart from European conflicts while warning Europe to stay out of the Americas, were being sown during George Washington's time in office. Historian S.E. Morrison points out that by 1783, the United States was already hinting at a hands-off approach to Europe's business, a stance that would later evolve into the Monroe Doctrine's additional warning for Europe to back off from the Americas. Even though the Monroe Doctrine hadn't been formulated yet, key figures like Alexander Hamilton were already thinking big. Hamilton, through his writings in the Federalist Papers, envisioned the United States growing into a significant power capable of excluding European influence from the Americas, despite Europe's more extensive territorial claims in the region. James Madison, who served as Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State before becoming president, also made it clear to the United States ambassador to Spain that America was against European nations acquiring more territory on the continent. This attitude was maintained even under Jefferson, who was pro-French but still upheld the policy of no further European colonization in North America. The United States was particularly wary after the Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815, fearing that the victorious European powers would try to reintroduce monarchies. The establishment of the Holy Alliance by nations like Prussia, Austria, and Russia aimed at defending monarchism and even planning to restore it in places like Spain and its independence-seeking colonies only heightened American concerns. The United Kingdom, while not directly involved in the Monroe Doctrine, actually supported its main goal, preventing further European colonization in the New World. This shared interest stemmed from Britain's worry that its trade with the Americas might be jeopardized if other European nations expanded their colonies. For many years, Britain was essentially the guardian of the doctrine, using its formidable navy to enforce it, since the United States lacked the naval strength to do so on its own. The United States was hesitant to make a joint declaration with Britain, though, mainly due to the lingering bitterness from the War of 1812 and an incident in 1821 when Russia claimed rights over the Pacific Northwest, challenging United States interests. The Monroe Doctrine, primarily composed by John Quincy Adams, who would later ascend to the presidency, is a document enriched with diplomatic language. Fundamentally, it reduces to two principal contentions. The initial point is the doctrine's preamble, which unambiguously states that the continents of the Americas are henceforth closed to European colonial endeavors. It effectively communicates, given that the American continents are now liberated and sovereign, they should not be considered territories ripe for future European colonization. The second significant portion of the doctrine speaks directly to European nations. It essentially informs them that while the United States will abstain from engaging in the affairs of existing European colonies within the Americas, it vehemently contests any fresh endeavors to colonize independent Spanish-American republics. The underlying message conveyed is, we have resolved to refrain from involved in the concerns of present European colonies. Nonetheless, for those nations within the Americas that have battled for and secured their independence, an independence we fully acknowledge, we would perceive any effort by European powers to dominate or subjugate them as an aggressive action against the United States. Originally, Monroe's proclamation was not recognized as an all-encompassing directive on foreign policy, and it garnered minimal attention. It was only in later years that individuals began to view it as a pivotal framework of American strategy to curb European meddling in the Americas, a posture that only crystallized as a fundamental aspect of America's external policy stance in the mid-20th century. At the time the doctrine was announced, the United States did not have a strong navy or army, so it was not taken seriously by the rest of the world. Prince Metternich from Austria was especially upset by it. He thought of it as a rebellious move by the U.S., believing it would empower those looking to cause trouble and boost the morale of conspirators. On the other hand, the British somewhat agreed with the doctrine, but not openly. They supported it as part of their own strategy, called the Pax Britannica, which was about keeping the seas neutral. This approach was in harmony with Britain's preference for free trade over the more restrictive mercantilism. The rapidly expanding British industries were looking for new markets for their products. Therefore, keeping Latin American nations independent and out of Spain's control was in Britain's interest, because if these nations were recolonized, the Spanish would limit British access with their trade restrictions. Latin America had a mixed but overall positive reaction to the Monroe Doctrine, though there were moments of skepticism. According to John A. Crow in his book titled The Epic of Latin America, key figures in the fight for Latin American independence, such as Simón Bolívar, while still battling the Spanish, along with Santander in Colombia, Rivadavia in Argentina, and Victoria in Mexico, welcomed the support that Monroe's statement represented, expressing deep gratitude for it. Crow points out that these leaders were pragmatic. They recognized that the United States president didn't have much influence at the time, especially without the support of Britain and its formidable naval power. They understood that while the Monroe Doctrine was a nice gesture, the real guarantor of their nation's independence was Britain, not the United States. In 1826, Bolívar even organized what could be considered the first Pan-American meeting in the Congress of Panama, showing that, for him and his colleagues, the Monroe Doctrine was more a matter of national policy than a collective action plan for the hemisphere. Crow mentions that it was not meant to be, and was never intended to be, a charter for concerted hemispheric action. Meanwhile, skepticism about the actual motives of the Monroe Doctrine lingered among some. Diego Portales, a prominent Chilean businessman and minister, cautioned in a letter to a friend about being overly trustful of the United States, suggesting that to Americans in the North they considered themselves the only true American. In the countries that now constitute Latin America, Royalist guerrillas continued their struggle for Spain well beyond the conclusion of the principal wars for independence. Spain even attempted to reclaim Mexico in 1829, but when all was said and done, only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained under Spanish dominion until the Spanish-American War in 1898 altered this status quo. In the initial months of 1833, Britain chose to reaffirm its sovereignty over the Falkland Islands, an action contrary to the Monroe Doctrine's principles. Despite this, the United States did not intervene, instigating doubts within Latin America, notably Argentina, regarding the United States' dedication to protecting its neighbors from European meddling, as George C. Herring noted. From 1838 to 1850, Argentina was subjected to a naval blockade from France with Britain's support, yet the United States still abstained from intervening, disregarding the Monroe Doctrine's Council for Mutual Assistance in the Americas. In 1842, President John Tyler of the United States expanded the Monroe Doctrine to encompass Hawaii, instructing Britain to steer clear, which initiated the incorporation of Hawaii into the United States sphere. Later, in 1845, President James Polk proclaimed that the Monroe Doctrine should be rigorously observed to deter European nations from disrupting American westward expansion, adopting the concept of manifest destiny. By 1861, amidst the United States Civil War, Pedro Santana in the Dominican Republic extended an invitation to Spain to reintroduce colonial rule, under the impression the United States was too preoccupied to take notice. Nonetheless, following the conclusion of the Civil War, the United States re-invoked the Monroe Doctrine, prompting Spain to withdraw its forces from the Dominican Republic within that same year. During the Civil War, France seized the opportunity of the United States' distraction to establish a puppet monarchy in Mexico, but once the war concluded, the United States coerced France into departing. Notably, this era signified the Monroe Doctrine's evolution from a policy recommendation to a fundamental aspect of United States foreign policy, as evidenced when Spain briefly seized control of the Chincha Islands in 1865, constituting another infringement of the principle. Despite these provocations, the United States did not object to the British consolidation of their territories in Belize into British Honduras during or following the Civil War. However, in the 1870s, President Ulysses S. Grant sought to substitute European influence in Latin America with that of the United States and broadened the Monroe Doctrine to prohibit any European territorial assertions on the continent. His initiatives included an unsuccessful bid to annex the Dominican Republic in 1870. The engagement of the United States in a territorial dispute between Venezuela and Britain in 1895 represented a pivotal point in Anglo-American relations and underscored the Monroe Doctrine's function in American foreign policy. The United States boldly affirmed its supremacy in the Americas, a posture Britain ultimately opted not to contest, recognizing the United States' interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine and its sway in the hemisphere. This dispute stands as an early instance of the United States' assertive foreign policy in the Americas, highlighting its stature as a global power. Finally, in 1898, the participation of the United States in Cuba's quest for independence from Spain led to the Spanish-American War, culminating in Spain surrendering Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam to the United States and acknowledging Cuban independence, albeit Cuba remained under United States stewardship until 1902. Initially crafted by John Quincy Adams, who would later become president, the Monroe Doctrine was primarily a statement against colonialism, expressing the United States' moral stance on the issue. It essentially informed the world that the United States was against colonial expansion. However, as America started becoming a major global power, this doctrine outlined an area of influence the United States controlled, making it a challenge for others to oppose. Before he was president, Theodore Roosevelt used the Monroe Doctrine to justify intervention in Cuba, which was then a Spanish colony, in 1898. The Venezuela crisis between 1902 and 1903 demonstrated the United States' readiness to deploy its naval power to help stabilize countries in the Caribbean and Central America struggling to pay their international debts. This was done to prevent European countries from stepping in to resolve such financial issues themselves. The situation in Venezuela and how it was resolved played a big part in developing the Roosevelt Corollary. The Drago Doctrine came into play when Argentina's foreign minister, Luis Maria Drago, stepped up in December 1902. He was responding to Britain, Germany, and Italy blockading Venezuela because it wouldn't pay off a huge debt acquired by previous leaders for President Cipriano Castro. Drago's stance was simple: no European force could push an American nation into paying its debts. Theodore Roosevelt, however, did not see Drago's policy as fitting with the Monroe Doctrine. In 1904, Roosevelt introduced the Roosevelt Corollary, allowing the United States to intervene in Latin America if there was extreme and ongoing wrongdoing, to stop Europeans from stepping in over unpaid debts. This move, often linked to Roosevelt's speak softly and carry a big stick approach, stirred discontent across Latin America. The Roosevelt Corollary extended the Monroe Doctrine beyond merely preventing European influence in the Americas. It allowed the United States to use military force in Latin America. Critics argue that this was a significant shift from the doctrine's original intent and marked the beginning of the United States acting as a hemispheric policeman, which fundamentally altered political and economic relations between the United States, Latin America, and Europe. After World War II kicked off, most Americans were in favor of protecting all of the Western Hemisphere from foreign attacks. A survey conducted in 1940 revealed that 81% of respondents were all for defending Canada, 75% were behind the protection of Mexico and Central America, 69% supported safeguarding South America, 66% were in favor of defending the West Indies, and 59% believed in defending Greenland. In December 1941, the takeover of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon by the Free France forces, which took it over from the control of Vichy France, was seen by Secretary of State Cordell Hull as a breach of the Monroe Doctrine. After the year 1898, key figures in South America, such as Luis Maria Drago from Argentina, Alejandro Alvarez from Chile, and Baltasar Brum from Uruguay, started to see the Monroe Doctrine, a policy opposing European colonialism in the Americas, in a new light. These scholars from countries like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay wanted to reshape how countries interacted on an international level, favoring cooperation over intervention. They even suggested that the concept might originally have come from Manuel Torres, offering a different perspective on its origins. Despite these ideas, American leaders weren't ready to give up the practice of stepping into other countries' affairs until President Franklin Roosevelt introduced the Good Neighbor policy in 1933, which promised a more hands-off approach. This policy didn't last beyond 1945, though, because the Cold War heightened the United States' focus on keeping Soviet influence out of the Western Hemisphere. This shift marked a return to more interventionist policies in Latin America, moving away from the Good Neighbor policy's ideals. The control over the Monroe Doctrine then passed to the Organization of American States, established in 1948, to foster regional solidarity and cooperation. In a significant moment in 1954, U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles cited the Monroe Doctrine at the 10th Pan-American Conference in Caracas, Venezuela, criticizing Soviet involvement in Guatemala as a threat. Highlighting the enduring relevance of the Monroe Doctrine, President John F. Kennedy stated in a news conference on August 29, 1962, that the principle behind the doctrine remained the opposition to any foreign power expanding its influence into the Western Hemisphere. He pointed to the United States' actions against Cuba as a clear example of this stance, emphasizing efforts to isolate the communist presence there as a priority for American foreign policy. During the tense times of the Cold War, the United States looked to an old policy called the Monroe Doctrine to shape its approach toward Latin America. This all came into sharp focus when Cuba turned communist between 1953 and 1959, linking up with the Soviet Union. American policymakers argued that under the Monroe Doctrine, it was essential to stop Soviet-influenced communism from spreading throughout Latin America. So the U.S. stepped in, providing intelligence and military support to governments in Latin and South America that were either under threat from communism or claimed to be. A notable example of this was Operation Condor. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is another key moment. President John F. Kennedy pointed to the Monroe Doctrine as justification for the U.S.'s stand against the Soviet Union, which had placed ballistic missiles in Cuba. This action was seen as a direct threat under the Monroe Doctrine. The debate over how the Monroe Doctrine was being interpreted heated up with the Iran-Contra affair. This controversy unveiled that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, had secretly trained guerrilla fighters known as the Contras in Honduras. Their mission was to destabilize and attempt to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government, led by President Daniel Ortega. In defending this action in 1984, CIA Director Robert Gates made a bold statement, claiming that not intervening in Nicaragua would mean completely abandoning the Monroe Doctrine. In November 2013, while addressing the Organization of American States, John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State under President Barack Obama, made it clear that the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. This stance suggested a move toward mutual partnerships in the Americas, something commentators believe aligns closer to what Monroe had originally intended, rather than the direction taken by policies after his passing. Fast forward to the Trump administration, and the tone reverts. In August 2017, President Donald Trump hinted at possibly employing the doctrine when discussing military intervention in Venezuela. This came after his CIA director, Mike Pompeo, pointed out that the nation was suffering due to interference from groups backed by Iran and Russia. Then in February 2018, Trump's Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, referred back to the Monroe Doctrine, labeling it a clear success, and cautioned against China's imperial trading ambitions while advocating for the U.S. as the region's preferred trading partner. Pompeo took over from Tillerson in May 2018. President Trump, at the 73rd UN General Assembly in 2018, doubled down on applying the Monroe Doctrine. This commitment did not go without critique. At the 8,452nd emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council on January 26, 2019, Vasily Nebenzia, representing the Russian Federation, criticized the U.S. for deploying the Monroe Doctrine. Venezuela joined this criticism, citing 27 interventions in Latin America as proof of the U.S.'s adherence to the doctrine, branding it as a direct military threat towards Venezuela. Cuba echoed these sentiments, announcing that the current U.S. administration had indeed declared the Monroe Doctrine active. On March 3, 2019, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor at the time, did not shy away from invoking the Monroe Doctrine to describe the Trump administration's policy in the Americas, stating, "In this administration, we're not afraid to use the word Monroe Doctrine. It's been the objective of American presidents going back to President Ronald Reagan to have a completely democratic hemisphere." Historians point out that, although the doctrine pledged to oppose any new European colonial efforts in the Americas, it ended up having some assertive effects on U.S. foreign policy. This stems from the fact that the doctrine didn't restrict the United States' own activities. J. Sexton, a historian, observed that the strategies to enforce the doctrine were inspired by the tactics European imperialist powers used back in the 17th and 18th centuries. American historian William Appleman Williams viewed the doctrine through a critical lens, labeling it as imperial anti-colonialism because it served as a form of American imperialism. Furthermore, Noam Chomsky has argued that the Monroe Doctrine, in actuality, has been leveraged by the United States as a proclamation of dominance and as justification for intervening in the affairs of the Americas at its own discretion. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.